Hello there, and welcome to this 3D Motive video course on creating Unity-ready modular environments in Blender. I'm Alan Thorne and I'll be your instructor in this third and final part of the course. Here we'll see how to optimize, configure and export our modular environments from Blender, ready to import into Unity for inclusion into our scenes. In addition, we'll use a range of Unity scene building tools to arrange and configure our environments into interesting and meaningful combinations that form a complete level, one that feels integrated and seamless. By the end of this part, you'll have all the practical knowledge you need to take your environment ideas from concept to completion, using Blender, GIMP and Unity, as well as any other content creation tools. The concepts and ideas in this course are not software limited. They're entirely transferable, so if you want to create modular environments for your game projects, then this is the course for you. So I'm here in Blender, and throughout this part of the course we're going to be having a look at how to export our models from Blender into Unity. And now it turns out there are a number of issues that arise when we commonly try to export our models. And so really the first section of this module, the first section of this part of the course, is going to be having a look at some of these issues, and I'll show you how to resolve them. Now, instead of focusing on the modular environments that we have created, I'm going to start by just focusing on a simple case study, which is by using the default scene here in Blender, which has just this cube. We're going to be looking at how to export the modular environments later, but in order to properly show you the issues that arise, I'm going to be working with this case study so that we can really isolate what problems are arising. So here I have this basic scene. This is the default scene that is created whenever you start Blender. And I want to, let's say, export this cube object that we've got at the center of our scene. Let's say I want to export this cube into Unity. Well, one way I could do this is by coming up here to the File menu, choosing File, and choosing Save, or I can press Ctrl S on the keyboard. And I'm going to give this scene a name. I'm going to just call this, for example, default scene, like so. Just going to call this default scene, .blend, and then just choose Save Blender File, like that. And now I've saved that scene. So what I'm going to do now is jump over to Unity and really import that scene file into Unity. Let's see what happens when we do that. So now I've jumped over to Unity, ready to import my blend file into the Unity project. So I'm just going to bring the Windows Explorer window into here so I can see the default scene.blend file that I have saved. I'm going to drag and drop that file here into the project panel to import it into Unity. And just release my mouse. I'm just going to move the Windows Explorer window out of the way. And you'll see that it imports default scene, and I can see some mesh properties for it here, but if you look at the console here, you can see Blender could not convert the blend file to FBX file. And this is a strange error because it's saying, well, hey, you've imported a blend file, but we cannot convert it to an FBX file to work in Unity. Now, this is a problem that I found is quite common, and it happens on my computer and a whole range of other computers that I've tested it with. Now, sometimes Unity is supposed to support the blend file format, and there are cases where it does import it, but sometimes it simply doesn't work. And there are various ways in which you can make efforts to correct this issue. I'm going to jump back over to Blender to show you one issue that could cause this problem, but for me it is not the cause. So I'm just going to jump back over to Blender and show you what the cause could be. Now I'm back here in Blender, and if you're experiencing the blend file import issue that I've just received, then there is something you can do to try to fix it. You can come over here in Blender and choose File and User Preferences, or press Ctrl-Alt-U on the keyboard to bring up the User Preferences dialog, and you want to make sure that you choose the Add-ons tab, and in the Add-ons tab just scroll down until you see Import Export options, and you want to look for Import Export Autodesk FBX format. And you want to make sure that this is enabled. Make sure there is a tick in this box. If there is no tick in this box, then that could be the cause of your problem. But for me, there is a tick, and yet I still do receive the problem. So that is not the cause for me. And I'm not entirely sure what the cause is, but it doesn't really matter because there's an alternative way to get your models into Unity. So generally speaking, I would recommend avoiding the blend file format for importing your models into Unity. It requires you to have Blender installed on your computer, and then sometimes it doesn't work and it can cause you a bit of a headache. So rule number one when exporting to Unity is generally try to avoid using the blend file format. Instead, we're going to be using the FBX add-on to export to FBX files, and we'll look at how to do that next. So now I'm back in Blender in the default scene that I've saved. In the previous movie we tried exporting this to a blend file to import into Unity, and it seemed that either Unity or Blender or both, they really didn't like that very much at all, and we weren't able to do it successfully. So in this video what I want to do is to use the FBX format. So to do that, all I have to do is move up here to the File menu and choose File and Export, and then select Autodesk FBX. I'm going to select that option and it displays this scene here. Now on the left hand side at the bottom here we have these Export FBX properties, and these are pretty much the default settings. Now we're going to be having a look at these settings in upcoming movies, but right now I'm going to leave all of these settings at their defaults and just leave it as it is. I have the default scene.fbx as the default name for this scene, so I'm just going to leave these defaults and choose the Export FBX button, and there we have it. We've just done it. We've exported this scene to an FBX file. So that's ready to go. Now I'm going to jump back to Unity and try importing this one and see if that works. So let's try a Blender to Unity import take 2. I'm going to bring in a Windows Explorer window here, and you can see we've got default scene.fbx. I'm going to drag and drop that file into the project panel to import it into Unity, and then just move the Windows Explorer window out of the way. You can see by taking a look at the project panel that we already have some measure of success with importing this file. We have our cube object and a materials folder that contains the default materials imported with the Blender scene. But however, there are still problems, and I can see what they are by just clicking on this rightward pointing arrow to have a look at some of the internals of this mesh asset. You'll see that we have the cube mesh that we wanted to import, but we also have this default take animation data, and well, our object doesn't contain any animation at all, so we don't really want that data. We also have a camera object, and this is not the Unity camera in the scene here. That's listed in the hierarchy panel. This is the camera that was included in the Blender scene, and we don't want that data. And also we've got a lamp object which was included in the Blender file as well, and we don't want that either. So there's quite a lot of extra data here that we really don't want to be importing. It's completely unnecessary data. So we need to find a way to selectively import only certain objects and exclude others. And perhaps a more significant problem, however, if I select this cube mesh here and I take a look in the preview panel, you'll see that the shading of this cube is just completely off. This is not how the cube looks when shaded in Blender. This has a kind of smooth shading all over, and that's because really Unity is not recognizing these sharp edges here. It just thinks this is all one completely smooth surface. Now we can actually repair this issue very quickly and easily in Unity by scrolling down here, and under Normals we can choose Calculate, and I'm going to press Apply, and you'll see that then it does fix the shading of the cube. That is a quick way to repair this issue, but I want to show you a more powerful way to do it in Blender at source that gives you much more control over the shading of your objects. So I'm going to switch this setting back from Calculate to Import, which is what it was at, and then choose Apply, and we get that wrong sort of smooth shading again. Another problem is if I click and drag the cube into the scene, it appears completely invisible. You can see it listed here in the hierarchy panel, and in fact it also brings in lots of other data like the camera, the cube, the lamp. We don't want all of this data, and we really cannot see our object in the scene. And the reason for that, let's just delete this object. The reason we can't see it is because over here on the object you can see that the scale factor is set to 0.01, and that's a very small scale indeed. Let me just delete that object, didn't delete it there. I'm going to select the object and change the scale to 1, scroll down and click apply, and now when I drag and drop the object into the scene it works properly, but by default it was set to a completely inappropriate scale. So now we're going to be coming in and starting to address these issues. We're going to be looking at how to do that next. So I'm back here in Blender, and the first issue that I want to address is the smooth shading issue that we saw when we tried to import this cube into Unity. When we imported the cube in Unity, this cube was completely smoothly shaded, and we can see from the Blender scene that that is not really how Blender renders the cube at all. It recognizes that these edges should be sharply shaded. So let's see how we can fix that, and the way we do this is by selecting the edges in the cube and using the Mark Sharp tool to mark those edges as sharp edges. Let's see how that works. I'm going to press the Tab key on the keyboard to go into edit mode here. So we have the edit mode active, and I'm going to switch to edge mode by selecting these edges here, and I'm going to press Ctrl A on the keyboard to select all edges in the cube. The reason I'm selecting all edges for this model is because, well, this is a cube and we do want every edge to be sharply shaded. There are no smooth surfaces in this cube. If, for example, I wanted smooth shading between this face and this face, then I wouldn't select this edge because it wouldn't be a sharp edge. But in the case of the cube, every edge should be sharp, so I've selected them all. Then with those edges selected, I want to choose Mesh, Edges, and select Mark Sharp. And this works very much like Mark Seam, but we're not marking UV seams, we're just marking sharp edges. So I'm going to select Mark Sharp here. And when I do that, suddenly you can see these edges are highlighted in blue. If you don't have that blue highlighting, you can always activate it. Let's just open the Object Properties panel here, and under the Mesh Display group, make sure here that Sharp is enabled. If it's not enabled, then you won't see the sharp edges. So I'm going to activate Sharp and just move those properties out of the way here. Now, this is not all that you have to do, however, to get sharp edges to work in Unity. There's still more that you have to do. So what else do we need to do? Well, I'm going to exit edit mode and return back to object mode. Now that I've marked those sharp edges, I'm going to move over here to the modifiers tab. Let's just expand these properties and select the modifiers tab here. And I'm going to be adding an edge split modifier to this cube. So I'm going to add the edge split modifier, and I'm going to disable the check in edge angle and just leave sharp edges activated. What this modifier will do is that when we come to export this cube to an FBX file, it will run through all the sharp edges in the cube and actually split the faces apart. And that is how Unity will sort of get the shading right for the cube. One thing that we don't want to do at all is click the apply button here to bake those changes in the mesh. If we do that, then all of these faces in the mesh will be cut apart in Blender, and that's not really how we want to work with the object. We still want to continue working with this object as one seamless mesh. We don't want to split apart the faces. We only want this modifier applied when we export this object to an FBX file. So make sure you don't click apply there. So that is really how we get sort of up and running with sharp edges and how we can achieve sharp looking shading for our object when we import it into Unity. Now, of course, there's still more to do in the export process, so I'm not going to export this to an FBX just yet. We're going to be looking at the extra sort of steps that we have to perform in the next video. Now we've marked the sharp edges in the cube, so it's almost ready to export, but there's still some other things that I want to do. For example, it's a good idea to give all of your objects some default UV mapping. Now, in most cases when you're creating detailed models, you will apply your own custom mapping, but in the case of this primitive, I've really not given this any kind of mapping at all, and Blender doesn't give it any mapping by default. So I'm going to move over here to the Object Data tab, make sure the object here is selected, and then in the UV Map section, I'm just going to click the plus icon, and that's it. I've really just there giving it some default UV mapping. This might not be the kind of mapping that I want, but still, it's given it some mapping nonetheless. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start to export this object to an FBX file, and before I go ahead and choose File, Export FBX, make sure that you select the object that you want to export. We don't want to export the lamp, we don't want to export the camera or any other objects in the scene. We just want to export the selected object. So I'm going to select that cube here and then choose File and Export and then Autodesk FBX. So here now I've got the FBX dialog, and let's take a look at some of these Export FBX options. Now we know, for example, that we just want to export the cube mesh, which is the selected object. So I want to enable the selected objects here. So I just want to export only the selected objects. For now I'm going to leave the forward and up as they are, with -Z forward and Y up. And what sort of things among the selection do we want to export? Well, I only want to export the mesh. That's the only kind of object I'm interested in exporting. So I'm going to click on that mesh there to select the mesh. We just want to export the mesh and make sure all the others are deselected. I want to apply the modifiers on export, which means that the edge split modifier will be applied to our model. The rest of the data, the animation data, I want to disable and completely just switch off. So I'm going to remove the tick from all of the rest of the options here and leave it at those settings. And now I'm going to choose export to that file. And we've exported this now to an FBX. So let's import this into Unity and see how it looks now. Okay, so are you ready? Let's import our FBX file. I'm going to drag the Windows Explorer window in here and drag and drop the default scene.fbx into the project panel. Let's move this out of the way, and okay, yes, this is looking much better. If I select this cube now, you can see in the viewport that default shading, that edge split modifier has really helped those edges come out as sharp now. So that's looking pretty good. We no longer need to scroll down here and use the calculate option. We can use the import settings for the normals. So that's looking very good. And if I click on the right pointing arrow and expand the asset, you can see, oh yes, this is looking much, much better. We're just exporting just the data that we need, only that selected data. That's looking very good. The only problem that we are left with, however, is you will see that the scale factor for this mesh is still 0.01. Now this is a problem because every time I'm going to import my meshes, it will make them very, very tiny. We could of course change it to 1 and then press apply, but doing that for every single mesh we import is a rather tedious process. And there is a solution available to get Unity to set this to 1 by default. And we're going to be looking at how to do that next. Now we're going to solve the mystery of the FBX scale factor. And to do this, I've navigated to the Unity Answers website in a web browser, and you can access that page by navigating to answers.unity3d.com. And I've isolated a specific question here, which is questions 12187 import settings.html, and the question reads, why do my models always appear in Unity at 0.01 scale? And that's the question that we are asking, and there's a solution. If I scroll down, you can see we solved this issue with an editor script, and this answer was kindly provided by Herman Tuliken. And you can see that we've got some source code here, which is C# source code. I'm going to select that source code and press Ctrl+C on the keyboard, and then I'll jump over to Unity to show you how we can set this up so that our models will always import at the scale of 1 as opposed to 0.01. So let me just move this web browser window out of the way, and behind us we have this default Unity project here. The first thing I'll do is right click and choose Create and Folder to create a new folder in the project. I'm going to name this folder Editor, and you have to do the same thing. You must call this folder Editor. We're going to create a class inside, and any other name won't do for this folder. It must be called Editor. So I'm going to double click to go inside the Editor folder, and again right click and choose Create and C# script. So we're going to be adding a C# script, and I'm going to call this script file FBX scale fix like so, and press enter on the keyboard. I then double click this file to open this up in Mono Develop, and you can see we have our file here. I'm going to highlight all of this source code and press Ctrl+V on the keyboard to import it in here. So I'm just going to save those changes with Control S and then just minimize mono develop. And as I do that and return to Unity, it compiles that code. I'm just going to return back to the assets folder. Everything here is looking good. And now let's import our FBX file. So I'll bring in a Windows Explorer window, drag and drop default scene.fbx into the project panel, move this out of the way, and you can see the file has been imported. But if we select it and inspect it further, you can see over here in the object inspector, scale factor of 1. So it's not 0.01, but it's 1. And any project that has the editor folder with that script inside will always import every single mesh by default with a scale factor of 1. So that is how you can solve the FBX scaling issue. So now we're good to move on. Now you may think that we've removed every single obstacle to exporting a model from Blender to Unity and that everything should work fine now, but that's not quite true. There is one obstacle remaining to us that is going to cause us problems, and to demonstrate this I've created this Blender file here called navigator.blend. You will find this in the course companion files if you want to follow along. It has this kind of pointy nose and an arrow pointing upwards. I'm now going to export this file by choosing File, Export and Autodesk FBX, and I'm going to save this as nav.fbx and leave all these settings at their defaults. We've seen these settings before. I'm going to choose Export FBX like so, and then just jump over to Unity and import this file and just see what happens. So here I am in Unity. You can see we've got our editor folder with the necessary script in there to set the FBX scale. Let's bring in a Windows Explorer window, select the nav.fbx mesh, drag and drop that into the project panel, and let's see what happens. Here we have our nav mesh, and you can see if I expand this, we've got some problems. You will see that this cube mesh here, we have the upwards pointing arrow, the forwards pointing arrow, but this mesh appears to be rotated. In Blender, we had one of these arrows pointing upwards and one of them pointing forwards. So that really is not right at all. It should have been something like that. And you can see here on this mesh that we do have an arrow pointing upwards and an arrow pointing forwards, which is correct. But if I look at the default settings for this mesh, you can see that a rotation of 270 degrees has been applied on the x-axis. And if I drag and drop this into the scene, you'll see that the forward pointing arrow in the Z direction has nothing on it at all. And the forward pointing arrow here is not aligned to the axis at all. So this really should be looking the other way. So that is not right. This object has been rotated, and the reason is because in Unity the y-axis is up and in Blender the z-axis is up. So the coordinate system has been rotated. So in the next video we're going to be looking at how we can solve this issue by going back to Blender. So in this movie I want to show you how we can configure and export our models in Blender to align with the Unity coordinate space. We know in Blender that we have a Z-oriented coordinate system, meaning that Z is up and Z, according to the coordinate display, is the blue axis. And in Unity, the up axis is the Y axis. So we need to configure our model to be oriented to the Unity-based system here. So I'm going to open up the Object Properties tab by pressing on this plus icon to display the transformation properties here for this object. So the first thing we need to do with this object is to we know that Y, which is the green axis, is up in Unity, and that the Z axis here is forwards. So we need to rotate this model to align with that space. So on the X axis, I'm going to rotate the model by -90, and on the Y axis, I'm also going to rotate by -90. And now you can see the up of this model, the up arrow is pointing in line with the y-axis, and the forwards of the model here, the forwards arrow, is pointing in line with the z-axis. Now before we go ahead and do anything else, we've got these rotation properties set in here, and I want to bake these into the model. I do that by choosing Object, Apply, and I choose Rotation, and that will reset the rotation back to 0, but the model stays oriented how it is. Then I want to export the model. I'm going to make sure the model is selected here in the viewport and choose File and Export and Autodesk FBX. and I'm going to scroll down, and in the FBX properties, make sure we have them all at their usual settings that we've applied. So mesh, selected object is enabled, and apply modifiers. And for the forwards axis, I want to make sure that this says Y forward, and for up, I want to make sure that we have Z up. And then I'm going to export nav.fbx, and that has exported the model with the correct settings. I'm now going to jump over to Unity and import this model. So I'm back here in Unity with our editor folder with the FBX script inside, and let's import our exported model, which is nav.fbx. I have this here in the Windows Explorer view. I'm going to drag and drop that into the project panel here and just move the Windows Explorer window out of the way. You can see from the project panel that right now this model is aligned just as we want it. We have the top arrow pointing upwards, the forward one pointing to the front here. That's looking pretty good. And if I expand the mesh properties here, you can see that these two objects, the mesh data itself, aligns with our mesh object. So that's good. These two coordinate systems align. And if I scroll down further in the object inspector, you can see that the rotation for this object is 0, 0, 0, which means that no rotation is being applied. That means that the coordinate system of this object and the coordinate system of Unity will align. We can even prove that in the viewport. I'm going to drag and drop my mesh into the scene and set its position to the world space origin here. And I'm just going to press F on the keyboard to frame my model. And right now we have the global coordinate system specified. And you can see here that Z is forwards, then Y is up, and X is sort of coming out to the side. But when I change to the local coordinate space, there's no change in these axes at all, and that is because the global and the local coordinate spaces coincide with one another, and that's a good thing. So we're now in a position to export our models to the FBX format, and we're going to be applying everything we've seen so far to the models in our environment set, and I will do that in the next video. So now I've opened up the Blender file that contains all of the pieces for our modular environment. And what I want to do here is show you the complete workflow for exporting one piece from Blender to Unity. And that workflow will apply to all of the other pieces in the set, so that you then know how to export all of the pieces into Unity. So really the workflow I'm applying to this piece is just what we've seen before. So let's take a look at how this works. The first thing I want to do is to mark all the sharp edges in this mesh. So I'm going to press the Tab key on the keyboard, and we can see all of our edges. Now you can see the seams marked in red, but right now we have no sharp edges marked. So I'm going to change the mesh display from textured to solid. So I'm going to select the solid view here, not textured but solid. And now I'm going to make sure I'm in edge mode and start selecting the sharp edges. So we know we're going to have one sharp edge over here at the bottom where the floor meets the wall. So I'm going to select that long edge there and choose Mesh, Edges, and mark Sharp, and that's painted in blue to indicate that that is a sharp edge. We're also going to have a sharp set of edges around here because this is an area where the surface changes direction. So that also is going to be sharp, so I'm going to select Mark Sharp there. Again, we're going to have some sharp edges along here and along here, and as well we're going to have sharp edge there and there, so that's going to be Mesh, Edges, Mark Sharp. And I'm going to move further up, and again we're going to have another set of sharp edges at the top of the model here. So let's just select that edge, and I'll come over and select this one and this one. Notice we're not selecting that one in the middle because that's part of the complete surface. It blends with this entire surface up here. So I'm going to choose Mesh, Edges, and Mark Sharp. And I'm also going to do the same for the top here. So this edge, and choose Mesh, Edges, Mark Sharp. Now we also have the edges at the side on these pillar pieces here as well. So we're going to have an edge here, one here. We've already marked that one, so another edge there, another edge there. Let's move up a bit further and take a look at what we've got here. We're going to have another edge there, there, and there, as well as that edge. And just going to zoom out and take a look at what we've got here. We've got another edge here, 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 and yes, that's fine, that should be correct. mesh edges, mark sharp. So another sharp edge there. That's looking pretty good, so everything's marked out there. Let's take a look on the other side, and we're basically going to do the same thing. So I'm going to mark out that edge, that edge, that edge, this one, this one, this one, and another edge here. And again, another edge there actually. Did we mark the top edge on this side? Yes, we did, so that's okay. So I'm going to come further down and select this edge and this edge. Make sure we select all the edges necessary. So again, I think we've managed to select all the edges there. That's looking pretty good. So I'm going to go mesh, edges, and mark sharp. So what I've done in here, I've just now marked out all the sharp edges for our model. So that's looking pretty good. We need to go to the next step, which is getting this ready to export to FBX. Now, one thing I forgot to do in the previous movie was to mark some additional edges. There is one here, which I have now marked, this edge, and also the same edge which is over on this side, this edge. So I've now marked those as sharp, and you'll notice that our object does have an edge split modifier applied with the sharp edges checkbox ticked. We added that by just choosing add modifier edge split. So now we've marked all the sharp edges in this model, and the next thing I want to do is to apply the appropriate rotation for this mesh. So I'm going to open up the properties panel here, scroll up to the rotation section, and for the X rotation it's going to be -90, and for the Y rotation also -90, and I'm going to apply those changes by choosing Object, Apply, and Rotation to bake in that rotation. Now with this object selected, like so, here it is, selected, I'm going to choose File, Export, Autodesk, FBX, and I'm just going to export this piece as the straight section. So I'm going to call this straight section 01 perhaps, because we have several straight sections. I'm going to scroll down, make sure that selected objects is enabled. The scale should be 1. We should have Y forward, Z up, mesh selected, and apply modifiers checked, and everything else below here should be deactivated because our object contains no animation data. So I'm going to leave those settings as they are and choose Export FBX, and that object has now been exported to an FBX file. So with that said, I'm going to jump over to Unity and import this piece along with the associated texture, and we'll see how that looks. So here in Unity, I'm now ready to import the first piece for our modular environment. So I'm going to bring in a Windows Explorer window, and you can see here we've got the straight edge section that I have exported. So I'm going to drag and drop that into Unity. Let's just minimize the Windows Explorer window. And here we have that straight section, and you can see from the shaded display that those normals are now looking correct. We have those sharp edges taking effect. It's imported at a scale factor of 1, and it's also imported a default material that is associated with that model. Now I'm going to also create a new folder, create and folder, and I'm going to name this texture, which is where I'm going to import the texture file. Let's bring in a Windows Explorer window. Here is the texture that we have created in the earlier part of this course. So I'm going to drag and drop that into Unity as well. You can see that has been imported. Notice that the default size here is 1024, but I'm going to change that to 4096 and then just click Apply. Wait for that to take effect. Now if you're exporting your project to mobile platforms, you would typically use a texture size that is smaller than that, perhaps 1024 or 2048. So I'm just going to leave it for now for 4096 because we can use that for desktop platforms. I'm going to move back to the materials folder and select the mod.env material that has been imported, and for the texture swatch here I'm going to select the texture that we've imported and go back over here to our assets, and you can see we've got our modular asset here, and in the preview window it has that texture applied. I'm going to drag and drop that into the viewport, and there we can see we've got our texture applied to our model, and everything here is looking pretty good. So our model has been imported successfully and we have the texture applied. What I'm going to do now off screen is export all the rest of the modular environment assets in this way, and then we'll be ready to import them all into Unity and get started at constructing a level.